You want me to marry a man I've never met because Grandpa promised it to a dying friend 40 years ago? It's not a debt, Wren. It's a promise. And in this family, we keep those. Then I'll make sure he's the one who wants out. I'll make sure Nathaniel Voss never wants to look at me twice. Careful, rich men don't scare off that easily. They will if I show up looking like I just walked off a chicken farm. And if he sees through it, then I suppose I'll finally meet a man smarter than his money. Wren Ashford buried her grandfather on a Tuesday in late October, under a sky the color of wet slate, with 9 people in attendance and not one of them family by blood. Colonel Silas Ashford had raised her from the age of 6, after her parents vanished from her life so completely that she couldn't remember either of their faces. He never explained why he'd taken her in. He only ever said that some debts outlive the people who owe them, and that a man who breaks a promise to the dead has broken the only promise that truly matters. She hadn't understood what he meant until the lawyer read the letter 3 days after the funeral. The letter named a family she had never met, the Voss family of Charleston, and a marriage her grandfather had arranged decades earlier with a man named Elias Voss. Back when they were young, and Silas had pulled Elias out of a burning transport truck on a road no ambulance could reach in time. Elias had sworn that if he ever had a grandson, and Silas ever had a granddaughter, the two families would be bound together properly, the old way, sealed by marriage rather than mere gratitude. Silas had laughed it off for years. He hadn't laughed when he wrote it into paper that named Wren directly. She read the letter twice, sitting on the porch steps of the only home she'd ever known, in the dress she'd worn to bury him, and felt something close over in her chest that she didn't have a name for yet. She had spent her whole life being told she had no people. Now, apparently, she had too many a fiancé she'd never met, a family she owed nothing, and a promise that wasn't hers to keep, except that it was, because her grandfather had asked her for exactly one thing in 22 years. And this was it. She thought about refusing. She thought about it seriously, for almost a full week, driving nowhere in particular with the radio off, trying to imagine walking into a stranger's mansion and calling it a life. She thought about the years before Silas, the ones she couldn't fully remember, and the years after, sitting across from him at a kitchen table while he taught her to read a ledger before she'd finished learning cursive, insisting that a girl with nothing could still learn to recognize value when she saw it, in a stone, in a contract, in a person. He had never once asked her for anything in return. Now he was asking, and he wasn't even alive to hear her answer. But underneath the anger was something smaller and more stubborn, a version of herself that still wanted, badly, to be the kind of granddaughter Silas Ashford would have been proud of. So she made a decision that felt less like surrender and more like a private joke only she was in on. She would go. She would keep the letter of the promise exactly as written. And she would make absolutely certain that the Voss family regretted asking. If they wanted a bride handed to them like a business asset, she decided she would give them the worst possible version of one clumsy, plain, sharp-tongued, and entirely uninterested in being charming. Let them see exactly how little they'd get for their trouble. Let the grandson, whoever he was, take one look and beg his own grandfather to release them both. She packed a single suitcase, left the porch light burning out of habit, though no one would be home to need it, and drove north toward a city and a family that had no idea what kind of guests they were about to receive. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The Voss estate sat behind iron gates on a stretch of coastline so manicured it looked staged, all white columns and clipped hedges, and a driveway longer than the entire street Wren had grown up on. She arrived in a car that rattled at stoplights, wearing a cardigan 2 sizes too big, her hair scraped back with none of the care she usually gave it, and a scowl she had practiced in the rearview mirror the whole drive down. The staff who greeted her exchanged a look she pretended not to notice. She had expected that look. She had counted on it. Inside, the family assembled with the particular stiffness of people performing hospitality they didn't feel. Elias Voss, silver-haired and steady-eyed, studied her for a long moment before something like relief crossed his face, not because of how she looked, she would learn later, but because she had come at all. His daughter-in-law was less generous, taking in the cardigan and the flat, unimpressed stare with an expression that curdled by the second. A cousin near Wren's age laughed behind a hand that didn't quite cover her mouth. Wren let all of it land without flinching, because flinching wasn't part of the plan. Nathaniel Voss was the last to arrive, coming in from the study with his tie already loosened, the tired posture of a man who ran a company larger than the small city he'd grown up minutes from. He stopped in the doorway when he saw her, and for one unguarded second, his face did something none of his relatives had. It went curious, rather than dismissive. He didn't laugh. He didn't recoil. He simply looked at her the way a man looks at a puzzle missing an obvious piece, and said it was a pleasure to finally meet the woman his grandfather had spoken of for so many years. Wren had rehearsed rudeness on the drive down, and she used every line of it clipped answers, a refusal to soften her voice, a pointed comment about how small the house seemed for so much money. She expected him to bristle, or worse, to laugh at her the way his cousin had. Instead, he watched her with an attention that made her uneasy, in a way sharp remarks usually didn't. When she finally excused herself to unpack, she caught him still watching from the hallway, arms crossed, wearing an expression she couldn't yet read, not offense, not amusement, something closer to a man doing quiet arithmetic and not liking that the numbers didn't add up the way he'd expected. Dinner that first night set the tone for most of the ones that followed. Nathaniel's mother steered the conversation toward topics designed to expose gaps in Wren's upbringing, schools she hadn't attended, cities she'd never traveled to, a wine list she pretended not to understand, simply because pretending was easier than admitting Silas had actually taught her more about vintages than most of the table combined. The cousin who'd laughed in the foyer kept up a steady stream of commentary about country manners loud enough to be overheard and quiet enough to be denied later if challenged. Wren ate slowly, answered in monosyllables, and let every comment land without giving anyone the satisfaction of a reaction. Only Elias seemed unbothered by the performance, watching her from the head of the table with the patient, unhurried attention of a man who had already decided the visit was worth having regardless of how it looked on the surface. Once, when the cousin's comments grew sharp enough that even the housekeeper flinched refilling water glasses, he simply said, without raising his voice, that a guest under his roof would be treated as family, or the person doing the treating could find another table to sit at. The room went quiet after that in a way it hadn't managed to on its own, and Wren caught, for the first time, a glimpse of why Silas had trusted this particular old man, with a promise that mattered enough to keep for 40 years. Word of the arranged bride reached Camille Sutton within a day, carried by a cousin eager to see someone else humiliated for once. Camille had spent 3 years positioning herself as Nathaniel's inevitable match, same social circle, same charity boards, same practice laugh at every gala, and she was not about to lose that position to a woman who, by every account she'd received, dressed like she'd raided a thrift store and had the manners to match. She arrived at the Voss estate the following afternoon, uninvited, dressed for a magazine cover, and found Wren in the garden looking exactly as unremarkable as promised. Camille didn't bother with subtlety. She circled Wren once, the way a buyer circles furniture she has already decided not to purchase, and delivered a string of comments calibrated to wound about the cardigan, about the flat shoes, about how some women simply weren't built for a family like the Vosses and ought to know it before they embarrassed themselves further. Wren absorbed it with the same flat calm she'd shown the family, offering nothing that could be repeated later as a scene, which seemed to frustrate Camille more than any argument would have. She left with a parting remark that the engagement wouldn't survive the month, delivered like a promise rather than an insult. What Camille hadn't accounted for was Nathaniel, standing at the study window with a clear view of the garden, who had watched the entire exchange without either woman noticing. He said nothing about it that evening, but the following morning he moved a meeting so that he could personally escort Wren to a company event neither Camille nor his mother had expected him to invite her to. It wasn't affection yet, Or not affection he could have named it, was something closer to a refusal to let a guest in his grandfather's house be treated the way he'd just watched Camille treat her. Whatever performance the guest herself seemed determined to keep giving. Wren noticed the gesture and didn't know what to do with it. She had built her whole strategy on being impossible to want. And here was a man doing small, deliberate things that suggested her strategy wasn't working the way it was supposed to. She told herself it didn't matter that he was simply being polite, that politeness cost a man like him nothing, but she caught herself, twice that week, checking whether he was in the room before she let her guard slip even slightly, and she didn't like what that habit might mean about the plan she'd arrived with. The company event Nathaniel had invited her to turned out to be a charity gala hosted at a downtown hotel, the kind of evening where every woman in the room had clearly spent months preparing, and Wren had spent exactly 9 minutes. Camille was there, of course, dressed like she'd been expecting to be photographed, and she made her way to Wren within minutes of the receiving line, with a crowd of onlookers trailing just close enough to overhear. She asked, loudly enough for a dozen people to catch it, whether the Voss family had run out of eligible women in Charleston or simply lost a bet. A ripple of laughter went through the small crowd, and for a moment Wren felt the old, familiar sting of being looked at like a mistake someone else had made. What saved the evening wasn't a clever retort. It was an accident, a floral centerpiece knocked loose from its stand by a passing waiter, scattering broken stems and water across a table, just as the gala's auction committee was preparing to unveil a donated painting meant to anchor the night's bidding. In the scramble, no one noticed that the painting's frame had been damaged until Wren, standing closest, quietly pointed out that the canvas itself was undamaged and that the frame could be repaired in an hour if someone knew how, and then, without waiting to be asked, did exactly that, borrowing tools from a stagehand and repairing the joint herself while the committee chair hovered nervously beside her. The room that had laughed at her 20 minutes earlier watched instead as she worked with a steadiness that had nothing clumsy about it, and by the time the auction resumed, the painting sold for nearly double its estimate, partly on the strength of the story now circulating about the woman who'd fixed it herself in evening gloves. Camille's remarks that night didn't land the way she'd intended them to. Nathaniel didn't say anything to Wren directly about it either, but she noticed, driving home, that he kept glancing at her in the passenger seat the way a man looks at something he's still trying to categorize correctly. 3 weeks into her stay, an old associate of the Voss family named Desmond Kane requested a meeting with Elias, framed as a courtesy call between longtime friends of the family. Nathaniel sat in on the meeting out of habit rather than suspicion, and it was only afterward, reviewing a supply contract Kane had casually mentioned, that he noticed a clause buried in dense language that would quietly transfer control of a key manufacturing partnership to Kane's company within 18 months. It was the kind of clause a distracted signature could miss and a careful one would catch, which told Nathaniel that Kane had been counting on distraction. He mentioned it to no one but his lawyer at first, assuming it was an isolated attempt at advantage-taking, the sort of thing that happened in business among men who had known each other 30 years and trusted each other exactly as far as their contracts required. He didn't yet know that Desmond Kane's interest in the Voss family went back further than any supply contract back to a badge, a battlefield decades old, and a debt Kane believed the world owed him and had never collected. Nathaniel only knew that something about the man's visit didn't sit right, and that feeling didn't leave him even after the contract was quietly rewritten. Wren noticed something too, though from an entirely different angle. She had spent years developing a private skill that had nothing to do with the Voss family or the engagement and eye for authenticated stones in provenance, honed under a mentor who had trained her in secret while her grandfather was still alive, mostly because Silas had insisted she have something of her own that no family, marriage, or inheritance could take from her. When Kane's assistant left a small case behind during the visit, forgotten in the study, Wren recognized one of the pieces inside instantly as a fake, dressed up convincingly enough to fool anyone without her specific training. She said nothing about it immediately, turning the discovery over in her mind the way she turned over most things carefully, and without letting her face show what she was thinking. She had come to Charleston planning to be underestimated on purpose. She hadn't planned on discovering this early, that being underestimated might turn out to be useful for reasons that had nothing to do with scaring off an engagement. For the first time since arriving, she found herself paying closer attention to the family she'd meant to alienate, rather than looking for the fastest way out the door. The Voss family had employed Mrs. Doyle for over 20 years, long enough that she'd raised half the household's children alongside her own, and long enough that no one thought to question her when small, oddly specific pieces of information began finding their way to Desmond Kane in the weeks before his supply contract visit. Wren noticed her first the way the older woman's hands shook slightly when she carried the tea service into the study, the way she lingered near closed doors a half-second longer than dusting required, the particular tightness in her shoulders whenever Kane's name came up at dinner. It read less like disloyalty and more like fear, and Wren had grown up around enough fear to recognize the shape of it. It took her another week to learn why. Mrs. Doyle's grandson had fallen behind on a debt to a man who worked, it turned out, for one of Kane's shell companies, and the arrangement offered to make the debt disappear had been simple and cruel in the way these arrangements always were small errands. Small updates on the household's comings and goings, nothing that felt like betrayal until it was already too late to stop. Wren found her crying quietly in the pantry one evening, and rather than reporting what she'd learned to Nathaniel immediately, she sat down across from her and asked, gently, how bad it had actually gotten. She didn't promise to fix it on the spot, because she'd learned young that promises made in a pantry rarely survived contact with the real problem. What she did instead was quietly arrange, through Larkspur's accounts rather than the Voss family's, to settle the debt herself before Kane's people could collect on it again, asking nothing from Mrs. Doyle in return, except that she'd tell Nathaniel the truth in her own time, in her own words, once the threat hanging over her grandson had actually been removed. It was a small kindness in the middle of a much larger fight, and it would matter more, later, than either of them understood yet. The scar on Wren's cheek had been part of the act from the beginning, applied each morning with a steady hand and enough skill that no one had questioned it until the afternoon. Nathaniel found her asleep in the garden, with her face turned toward the sun, and the makeup smudged just enough at the edge to look wrong. He didn't wake her. He stood there longer than he should have, working out what he was looking at, and by the time she stirred and caught him watching, he had already decided not to say anything about it that day, filing it away instead, alongside the other small inconsistencies he'd started keeping a private count of. There had been more of them than he wanted to admit. The clumsiness that vanished completely whenever she thought no one was watching her carry a full tray. The flat, uninterested voice she used at dinner that disappeared entirely when she thought she was alone in the study, humming something complicated enough that it couldn't have been picked up casually. The sharp, unimpressed remarks that always managed to land exactly hard enough to be memorable and never hard enough to actually be cruel, which was, he'd begun to realize, a much harder thing to pull off than genuine rudeness. A woman trying to seem unpleasant on purpose left fingerprints, if you knew to look for them, and Nathaniel had started looking. He brought it up finally over a meal neither of them had touched much of, asking without preamble whether the scar was real. Wren considered lying, weighed how much of the act still mattered to her, and found that it mattered less than she'd expected it to. She told him the truth in careful pieces, not everything, not yet, but enough. That she'd come to Charleston intending to make herself impossible to want. That she'd expected a spoiled heir who'd take one look and cancel the whole arrangement out of embarrassment. That she hadn't accounted for a man who kept noticing things she'd worked hard to hide. He didn't look angry, which surprised her more than anger would have. He looked, instead, like a man recalculating something he'd already half solved. And he told her quietly, without the teasing she'd half-braced for, that he'd rather spend his life with someone difficult to want than someone easy to want and impossible to trust. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't even close to one. But it was the first time since arriving that Wren felt genuinely unsettled by a member of the Voss family, and not in the way she had planned for at all. A week later, unable to sleep, she found her way to the music room at the far end of the house and sat down at a piano she hadn't touched since Silas's funeral, playing quietly enough that she was certain no one would hear. She was wrong. Nathaniel found her there past midnight, still in yesterday's clothes, and rather than announcing himself, he sat on the bottom step outside the doorway and listened for longer than either of them would admit to later, until the piece ended, and the silence that followed made it impossible for her to pretend she hadn't noticed him. She expected teasing, or at least a question about where she'd learned to play so well for a woman who'd spent months insisting she had no talents worth mentioning. Instead, he asked only what the piece was called, and when she told him it had been Silas's favorite, something her grandfather used to hum while fixing fences that never quite got fixed, Nathaniel didn't say anything clever at all. He simply sat with her a while longer, in a music room lit by one lamp, and for the first time since she'd arrived in Charleston, Wren let someone see her miss her grandfather without immediately looking away to hide it. The attack, when it came, arrived from 3 directions at once, which told Nathaniel immediately that it had been planned rather than opportunistic. A supplier Voss Holdings had relied on for a decade pulled out of a shipment without warning, citing concerns that traced back, unmistakably, to information no outsider should have had access to. A story broke in the local business press questioning the safety of a Voss product line, sourced to an anonymous insider. And within hours, Desmond Kane appeared publicly alongside a rival executive to announce a new partnership timed with a precision that could not have been coincidence. The stock dipped before the markets had even finished reacting to the headline. Nathaniel worked through the night trying to trace the leak, aware that whoever had fed information to Kane knew the company's internal workings well enough to do real damage. He suspected almost everyone in turn, and trusted almost no one fully, which was its own kind of exhausting. What he didn't expect was a phone call from a design studio he'd never done business with, offering through an assistant who wouldn't give a name to step in on the very partnership Kane had just poached, on terms generous enough to stabilize the company's public standing within days rather than weeks. The offer came from a small, well-regarded studio called Larkspur, run by a reclusive founder no one in Charleston business circles had ever met in person, known only for producing work far better than her modest client list suggested she needed to. Nathaniel accepted out of necessity more than trust, and it wasn't until the contracts were signed and the crisis had visibly begun to calm that he noticed the studio's handwriting on a design note matched, stroke for stroke, a shopping list he'd once watched Wren scribble at the kitchen counter. He said nothing to her directly. He simply started watching more closely, and liked what he saw. Wren had built Larkspur years before ever setting foot in Charleston, quietly, under a name that had nothing to do with Ashford, specifically so that nothing she built would ever be mistaken for something she'd married into. Stepping in to help the Voss family hadn't been part of any plan. It had simply seemed unbearable to watch a business unravel over a grudge that had nothing to do with the people currently losing sleep over it. When Nathaniel finally asked her outright whether Larkspur was hers, she didn't deny it, and something in his expression when she confirmed it told her he'd already suspected and had been waiting only to see if she would tell him the truth, unprompted. The hardest part of stabilizing the company wasn't the design contract itself, but the international partner Voss Holdings had relied on for years, a manufacturing group based overseas whose representatives had grown skittish the moment the local press story broke. Nathaniel had tried twice to reassure them by phone and gotten nowhere, and it was Wren, drawing on relationships she'd built quietly through Larkspur long before any of this began, who arranged a video call and walked the partner's leadership through the actual production numbers line by line, calm and specific in a way that no press release could have matched. By the end of the call, the partner had agreed not only to stay, but to increase their order for the following quarter. Nathaniel sat in on the second half of that call without saying a word, watching a woman his own family had spent weeks treating as an afterthought speak a language of contracts and margins as fluently as anyone in his boardroom. He didn't say anything about it to her directly that night either. He simply canceled a meeting he'd had scheduled for the following morning and asked, instead, if she'd have breakfast with him not to discuss the company. He clarified, just breakfast, which was a request he realized, saying it out loud, he had never actually made of anyone before. The lead on Wren's birth parents came from an old family friend of Silas's, a retired attorney who had helped arrange the original promise between the two grandfathers decades earlier and had quietly kept tabs on Wren ever since without ever explaining why. He told her, gently and without ceremony, that her biological family was the Marlowes, a well-known Charleston name, old money grown slightly threadbare, currently raising a daughter named Isabel, who had, as far as public records showed, no connection to the family beyond an adoption, finalized the same year Wren had gone missing from it entirely. Wren sat with the information for 2 full days before she let herself feel anything about it at all. She arranged to meet Gerald and Diane Marlowe at their home, expecting caution and finding something closer to calculation. Diane studied her face for a long moment with an expression that looked almost like recognition before smoothing itself into polite distance. Isabel, informed of the visit only minutes before, arrived dressed for confrontation rather than reunion, delivering a string of remarks about Wren's plain clothes and rough manners loud enough to be overheard by staff, clearly intent on making sure everyone in the house understood who the real daughter of this family was supposed to be. Gerald said almost nothing the entire visit, which told Wren more than anything he might have said aloud. The reunion soured within the week once word spread that Wren stood to inherit far more than the modest Marlowe fortune could ever provide, that her grandfather's estate, tangled as it was in old debts and older secrets, carried weight the family hadn't accounted for when they decided, decades earlier, that a missing daughter was easier to grieve than to search for properly. Diane's coldness thawed with a speed that had nothing to do with affection. Gerald began speaking of reconciliation in terms that sounded suspiciously like negotiation. Isabel, sensing the shift in the wind, adjusted her cruelty into something closer to false sisterly warmth, which Wren found harder to stomach than the open contempt had been. Wren gave the Marlowes exactly the chance their sudden change of heart deserved, which was very little. She listened to Diane's careful apology, watched Gerald hint at shared assets, endured one dinner where Isabel performed affection convincingly enough to fool anyone who hadn't watched her mock Wren's shoes a week earlier, and then told them plainly that a family that hadn't wanted her when she was poor didn't get to want her once she wasn't. She left without raising her voice, without slamming a door, and without the closure she might once have hoped a reunion like this would bring, trading it instead for a clarity she found she could live with far more easily than she'd expected. Isabel wasn't finished, though, and made one final attempt at a charity luncheon the following week, choosing a room full of Charleston's most attentive gossips to announce, loudly, that her long-lost sister had clearly inherited nothing but a chip on her shoulder and a talent for turning family generosity into public spectacle. She expected the room to side with her the way rooms usually had. Instead, several of the women present had already heard, through channels that traced quietly back to Larkspur's very real client list, exactly how the Marlowes had behaved the moment money entered the conversation, and Isabel's performance landed to a silence far colder than the one she'd been hoping to provoke in Wren. Wren didn't say a word in her own defense. She didn't need to. She simply finished her tea, thanked the hostess for a lovely afternoon, and left Isabel standing in a room that had quietly, collectively, decided whose side of the story it believed. It wasn't the kind of victory that made headlines, but it was, Wren thought on the drive home, exactly the kind Silas would have approved of, one, without raising her voice, and without needing to. Desmond Kane's interest in the Ashford name, it turned out, went back to a war neither Wren nor Nathaniel had lived through, a badge belonging to Colonel Silas Ashford, taken decades earlier under circumstances Kane had spent a lifetime rewriting in his own favor, used since then to quietly leverage assets that were never legally his to control. The attorney who had first told Wren about the Marlowes was the same man who finally handed her the paperwork proving it records Silas had kept sealed for years, waiting, apparently, For a granddaughter old enough and steady enough to use them properly rather than recklessly. Kane didn't go quietly. He arrived at the Voss estate one final time, uninvited, with the same practiced calm he'd used to poach a supplier and plant a false story, and told the assembled family that whatever paperwork Wren believed she had wouldn't matter against 30 years of established business relationships built on his side of the ledger. He was still talking when Nathaniel's legal team confirmed, over speakerphone, that the acquisition Wren had quietly arranged that same week had already transferred controlling interest in Kane's company into her name, using resources tied directly to the Ashford estate he had spent decades trying to erase the record of. The room went very still. Alias Voss, who had waited a lifetime to see the debt his old friend Silas once mentioned actually settled, allowed himself something close to a smile. Kane's protests grew louder and less coherent as the reality of what had happened settled over him, and it was Wren, not Nathaniel, who finally told him plainly that a badge stolen from a dying man's legacy doesn't stay stolen forever, no matter how many decades pass, and that some promises outlive the people who tried hardest to bury them. Security escorted him out with far less ceremony than he'd arrived with. Mrs. Doyle came to Nathaniel the following morning on her own, before anyone had asked her to, and told him everything: the debt, the pressure, the small pieces of information she'd handed over out of fear rather than malice, and the quiet way Wren had already ended the threat weeks before without ever once holding it over her. Nathaniel listened without interrupting, and when she finished, braced for whatever consequence was coming, he told her only that a woman who confessed the truth the moment she was free to had never really been the problem, and that her job, and her grandson's peace of mind, were both exactly as secure as they'd been the day she was hired. It was, Wren thought later, one of the clearest windows she'd gotten yet into the kind of man she'd agreed to marry. In the days that followed, the truth of who Silas Ashford had actually been spread quietly through Charleston's business circles, not a poor, reclusive old man raising a granddaughter alone, as most had assumed, but a decorated officer whose estate, carefully hidden for exactly this kind of moment, made the Voss family's fortune look almost modest by comparison. Wren found she didn't much care about the numbers. What mattered to her was smaller and steadier, the sense that she had finally kept the one promise Silas had ever asked of her, on her own terms rather than anyone else's, and that he would have recognized every part of how she'd done it. Nathaniel found her on the porch of the Voss estate at dusk, in the same worn cardigan she'd arrived in months earlier, which she still wore some evenings out of habit rather than necessity. He sat beside her without saying much at first, and when he finally spoke, it wasn't about Kane, or the company, or the fortune the whole city was now whispering about. He told her that he'd spent the first weeks of her stay trying to figure out what she was hiding, and the months after that trying to figure out why it mattered so much to him that he understood every part of it before anyone else did. He told her that he'd known for a long time that the act had stopped being about scaring him off, somewhere around the point where he'd started looking for reasons to be in the same room as her, rather than reasons to avoid an arranged engagement neither of them had asked for. He said he didn't want a wife chosen for him by two old men and a decades-old debt. He wanted the woman who'd walked into his family's house on purpose, looking like trouble, and had turned out to be exactly the kind of trouble worth keeping. He asked her, plainly and without any of the polish his family's world usually demanded of moments like this, to marry him not because of the promise, but in spite of it, as something entirely her own choice this time. Wren sat with the question longer than she needed to, not out of doubt, but because she wanted to feel the whole shape of it before she answered the porch, the cardigan, the ring he held out that was smaller and plainer than anything his family owned, chosen, he admitted, because he'd noticed she liked things that were real over things that were impressive. She thought about Silas, about the letter that had started all of it, about a promise she had once planned to break as loudly as possible. She told Nathaniel, yes, and meant it in a way that had nothing left to do with debts owed to the dead. They were married the following spring on the same stretch of coastline where she'd first arrived, scowling in an oversized cardigan, with Elias Voss seated in the front row wearing an expression of quiet, unshakable satisfaction, as though he'd known exactly how this would end from the moment Wren stepped out of her rattling car. Somewhere in the reception, tucked into the pocket of the dress she wore beneath her gown, Wren carried the small medallion that had once belonged to Silas Ashford, recovered, restored, and finally, exactly where it was always meant to be. She had come to Charleston to break a promise. She left it, having kept every part of it that actually mattered. That evening, after the guests had gone and the tent lights had dimmed, Wren walked alone down to the porch of the small house Nathaniel had bought her as a wedding gift without telling her first a modest place. Nothing like the Voss estate, chosen because it had a porch swing almost identical to the one on Silas's land, the one she used to sit on as a girl while he told her that some debts outlive the people who owe them. She sat on it now in her wedding dress, the letter that had started all of it folded in her hand, and allowed herself, finally, to feel the whole weight of missing him and being proud of herself in the very same breath. Somewhere behind her, she heard Nathaniel's footsteps on the gravel, unhurried, in no rush at all to interrupt a moment he seemed to understand belonged, first, to her and the grandfather who'd made all of it possible,